Welcome back to English Lane. Today we are telling the story of a name that means speed, danger, elegance, and obsession all at once. A name stitched onto racing jackets, painted onto the fastest cars on Earth, and whispered with genuine reverence by anyone who has ever loved motorsport. That name is Ferrari. But before Ferrari was a legend, it was one man's answer to unbearable grief. Before there were red cars roaring around famous racetracks, there was a young boy in a small Italian town who lost almost everything a person can lose, and somehow turned that loss into one of the most powerful names in the entire history of transportation. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a company most people associate purely with luxury and glamour was actually built from repeated tragedy, painful rejection, broken partnerships, and a stubborn refusal to ever build a car simply to make money. You will meet a man who saw racing not as a business strategy, but as something closer to a religion, one he was willing to sacrifice almost everything else in his life to serve. As always here on English Lane, listen carefully to the simple words and the steady, clear pace. This is graded reader-style English, designed to help your listening skills grow naturally, the same way a child slowly absorbs a new language, through story, through meaning, and through gentle repetition. Get comfortable, and let's travel back to the very beginning, to a small workshop in northern Italy, more than 120 years ago. And if stories like this one help your English grow, please subscribe to English Lane so you never miss the next journey we take together. Chapter 1. A Boy Who Fell in Love with Speed. Enzo Ferrari was born in 1898 in Modena, a quiet town in northern Italy, into a family that ran a small metalworking business. His father manufactured metal parts, and the family lived a modest, hard-working life, far removed from the glamour and luxury the Ferrari name would eventually come to represent. Everything changed for young Enzo in 1908 when he was only 10 years old. His father took him to nearby Bologna to watch an automobile race, and the experience left a permanent mark on the boy's imagination. The deafening roar of the engines, the blur of speed, the raw, almost violent energy of machines pushed to their absolute limit. All of it struck something deep inside him. From that single afternoon onward, Enzo Ferrari knew, with the simple, unshakable certainty that only a child can feel, exactly what he wanted his life to be about. This is worth pausing on for a moment. Enzo did not grow up surrounded by wealth, engineering schools, or powerful family connections in the automobile industry. He grew up in an ordinary workshop, watching his father shape metal by hand. What he carried instead of privilege was a single vivid memory of speed and sound that refused to leave him, a spark that would eventually outlast every disaster life would throw in his path over the following decades. There is something quietly important hidden inside this early chapter. Most extraordinary journeys do not begin with obvious advantages. They often begin with nothing more than one unforgettable moment, one spark of fascination that a person simply refuses to let go of, long after the excitement of that original moment has faded into the past. Chapter 2. Losing Everything Overnight. Just 8 years after that unforgettable day in Bologna, tragedy arrived at the Ferrari household with devastating speed. In 1916, in the middle of the First World War, an influenza outbreak swept through Italy. Within a short period, Enzo lost both his father and his older brother, who was also named Alfredo, but affectionately known within the family as Dino. The family's small metalworking business, dependent heavily on his father's leadership, quickly collapsed under the weight of this sudden loss. The war itself was not finished testing young Enzo either. He was drafted into the Italian army, where he served in an unglamorous role shoeing mules rather than anything resembling the excitement of racing he had once dreamed about. In 1918, the same devastating flu that had already killed his father and brother struck Enzo as well. He became critically ill, so severe that his life itself hung in serious doubt for a period, before he eventually recovered and was discharged from military service. Picture, honestly, the position this young man found himself in. Barely 20 years old, he had lost his father, his older brother, the family business that once supported him, and had nearly lost his own life to the very same illness. Any dream of racing cars must have seemed, at that exact moment, like a distant, almost embarrassing fantasy compared to the harsh reality now surrounding him. Yet it is precisely here, in this depth of loss, that something quietly significant took root. Enzo carried his brother Dino's name and memory with him for the rest of his life, eventually naming his own future son after this same lost brother. Grief, in Enzo's life, rarely disappeared quietly. It transformed instead into fuel, an intense, almost desperate determination to build something that could outlast the fragile uncertainty of life itself. Chapter 3. Rejected by Fiat, hired by nobody famous. After recovering from his illness and leaving military service, Enzo needed to rebuild his life from essentially nothing. Naturally drawn toward the automobile industry that had captured his imagination as a child, he applied for a position at Fiat, one of Italy's most respected and established car manufacturers at the time. Fiat rejected his application outright. There was no dramatic story behind this rejection, no secret conspiracy against him. He was simply an unknown young man with no formal credentials, competing among many other applicants for a position at a company that had no particular reason to notice him. It was an entirely ordinary rejection, the kind countless ambitious young people receive and quietly abandon their dreams over. Enzo did not abandon anything. Instead, he found humbler work as a mechanic and test driver at a small, considerably less famous automobile company in Milan called CMN. It was here that he met a fellow driver named Ugo Sivocci, who would become both a close friend and a valuable early connection within the racing world. In 1919, with Sivocci's help and encouragement, Enzo competed in his very first automobile race, driving in an uphill event between the towns of Parma and Poggio di Berceto. He finished a modest 9th place, hardly a triumphant beginning by any measure, but a genuine, real start nonetheless. There is something worth remembering in this quiet, unglamorous chapter of the story. The path toward eventually building one of the most prestigious car brands in human history did not begin at a prestigious company at all. It began with a rejection letter from Fiat, followed by a humble mechanic's job most people today have never even heard of. Prestigious beginnings are rare. Persistent beginnings, however humble, are what actually tend to lead somewhere significant. Chapter 4. 20 years in another man's colors. In 1920, Enzo's modest racing career caught the attention of Alfa Romeo, at the time one of the most respected and successful automobile manufacturers in all of Italy. He joined the company first as an official driver, beginning a professional relationship with Alfa Romeo that would eventually stretch across 2 decades of his life. In 1923, Enzo married Laura Garello, and the following year, in 1924, he achieved his first genuinely major racing victory at an event in Pescara. Slowly, steadily, his reputation within the competitive world of Italian motor racing continued to grow, moving him further and further away from that single, disappointing rejection letter from Fiat several years earlier. But something important was quietly shifting inside Enzo during these years as a driver for Alfa Romeo. He began to realize that his deepest passion was not necessarily sitting behind the wheel himself, chasing personal glory as an individual racer. What genuinely excited him instead was the complex, demanding work of assembling teams, coordinating talented drivers and skilled mechanics together, and building organizations capable of consistently winning, race after race, season after season. This realization carries a quiet but important insight worth remembering. Enzo Ferrari's ultimate legacy was never built primarily on his own skill as a racing driver, despite his genuine talent and respectable record behind the wheel. It was built instead on his rare ability to recognize and organize other people's talent, an underappreciated skill that would eventually define his entire remaining career, long after his own driving days had ended. Chapter 5. building a stable of champions. In 1929, working in Modena, Enzo founded his own dedicated racing team, which he named Scuderia Ferrari. The Italian word scuderia translates roughly to stable. In the same sense, one might refer to a stable of horses, and this name carried genuine significance. The team's emblem, a rearing black horse against a bright yellow background, had originally belonged to a celebrated Italian fighter pilot from the First World War named Francesco Baracca. This emblem, the now world-famous prancing horse, would eventually become one of the most recognized symbols in the entire history of global motorsport. Scuderia Ferrari operated as a specialized racing division working closely alongside Alfa Romeo, assembling a genuinely talented roster of drivers and mechanics under Enzo's careful, demanding leadership. The team achieved remarkable success throughout the early 1930s, winning race after race and steadily building a formidable reputation across the competitive landscape of European motorsport. In 1931, having participated in a total of 41 Grand Prix races across his personal driving career, recording 11 victories along the way, Enzo made the deliberate decision to retire from driving entirely. The following year, in 1932, his wife Laura gave birth to their only child, a son they named Alfredo, immediately nicknamed Dino, deliberately honoring the older brother Enzo had lost so painfully back in 1916. This combination of personal fatherhood and professional retirement from driving marked a clear, deliberate turning point. Enzo was now fully devoting himself to the demanding work of building and directing champions, rather than personally racing to become one himself. There is a quiet truth worth sitting with here. Sometimes the most meaningful contribution a person can make to something they deeply love is not to perform it personally at the highest possible level, but to build the structure, the team, and the environment that allows other talented people to reach heights the original person themselves may never have reached alone. Chapter 6. Losing the team he built. Despite years of hard-won success, Scuderia Ferrari's position within Alfa Romeo eventually grew complicated. By 1933, Alfa Romeo's own internal racing program had become increasingly mediocre, leading the two organizations into new negotiations that placed Enzo fully in charge of Alfa's entire racing effort. For several more years, Enzo continued directing this combined racing operation with real success and growing authority. But by 1937, Alfa Romeo made the decision to reclaim direct internal control over its racing division, effectively absorbing the very team Enzo had spent nearly a decade personally building from the ground up. It was a painful, familiar kind of loss, watching something built through years of dedicated effort slip out of his own hands, controlled instead by decisions made above him. Enzo remained at Alfa Romeo for 2 additional years under these changed, more restrictive circumstances, before finally resigning from the company entirely in September of 1939. As part of the formal separation agreement between them, Alfa Romeo included a deliberately restrictive clause, legally preventing Enzo from using his own family name, Ferrari, in direct connection with any racing cars or automobile manufacturing for a minimum period of 4 full years. Consider the strange, almost cruel irony contained within this specific requirement. The very name that would eventually become synonymous worldwide with automotive excellence was, for a period of years, legally forbidden from being used by the very man who carried it. Rather than breaking his resolve, this restriction seemed only to strengthen Enzo's quiet determination that whatever he eventually built next would belong entirely and completely to him alone, with no company or contract ever again capable of taking it away. Chapter 7. The birth of a new name. Bound by the restrictive terms of his departure from Alfa Romeo, Enzo could not immediately use his own family name for a new racing venture. Instead, he established a new company called Auto Avio Costruzioni, quietly continuing his work in automobile engineering and racing car design during this required waiting period, carefully building toward the moment when he would finally be free to use his own name once again. That moment arrived in 1947. With the mandatory 4-year restriction finally behind him, Enzo built and unveiled the very first car to officially carry the Ferrari name, a car called the 125S. That same car went on to achieve its first competitive victory almost immediately, a small but deeply symbolic triumph representing the true beginning of everything the Ferrari name would eventually come to represent across the following decades. Try to imagine the emotional weight contained within that particular moment. Nearly 3 decades had passed since a young, grieving Enzo first watched cars roar past him as a 10-year-old boy in Bologna. He had endured the deaths of his father and brother, survived a life-threatening illness, been rejected by Fiat, built and then lost an entire racing team under Alfa Romeo's ownership, and patiently waited out a legally mandated restriction before he could finally attach his own name to his own creation. Every single previous chapter of struggle had, in its own way, quietly led directly to this specific moment. This particular turning point carries a genuinely important truth. The most personally meaningful achievements in a person's life rarely arrive quickly or easily. They frequently arrive only after an extended, difficult sequence of setbacks, restrictions, and painful detours, each one testing whether the person still wants their original goal badly enough to keep pursuing it, even when circumstances make the pursuit deliberately, sometimes cruelly, difficult. Chapter 8. Racing first, everything else. Second. From this new beginning onward, Enzo Ferrari organized his entire business around one clear, unwavering priority. And it was never primarily about selling ordinary road cars to everyday customers. Racing came first, always. Enzo famously viewed the sale of Ferrari's luxurious road cars, the very vehicles that would eventually make the brand famous worldwide among wealthy collectors, as essentially a financial necessity, a way of generating enough revenue to fund what he genuinely cared about most deeply: competitive racing. In 1950, Ferrari entered the very first official Formula One World Championship season, and remarkably, the company has continued competing in Formula One continuously, without a single missed season, ever since that inaugural year, a distinction no other team in the sport's entire history can claim. Ferrari quickly built a reputation as one of racing's most formidable and consistently competitive teams, and by 1953 and 1954, Ferrari-powered cars had captured the World Drivers' Championship title. This unusual racing-first philosophy shaped nearly every decision Enzo made throughout his career. Where most car manufacturers primarily built cars to sell to the general public, occasionally participating in racing as a secondary marketing exercise, Ferrari operated in almost the exact reverse order. The company built beautiful, powerful road cars specifically because doing so generated the necessary funds to keep the racing team competitive, rather than the other way around. There is a valuable lesson hiding inside this unusual business philosophy. Enzo never allowed the pursuit of easy profit to quietly replace the original passion that had brought him into this industry in the first place. Many companies gradually drift away from their founding purpose once financial success arrives. Ferrari, under Enzo's demanding leadership, deliberately structured its entire business specifically to protect and continuously fund the original passion that had shaped his life since he was 10 years old. Chapter 9. Champion and Tragedy. Side by Side. Ferrari's growing success on the racetrack throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s arrived alongside a genuinely dark, difficult undercurrent that rarely appears in the glamorous, polished image most people associate with the brand today. Between 1955 and 1965, 6 different drivers racing for Ferrari lost their lives during competition, a devastating human cost that weighed heavily on the sport during this particular era, and specifically on Enzo himself as the man responsible for assembling and directing these teams. One especially tragic event occurred during the 1957 Mille Miglia, a demanding, dangerous open-road endurance race held across the Italian countryside. A Ferrari car involved in the event suffered a catastrophic failure, veering off the road directly into a crowd of spectators, resulting in 9 deaths among the bystanders who had gathered simply to watch the race unfold. Enzo himself was subsequently placed on trial, facing accusations of manslaughter connected to the tragic accident, though he was ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing. This period reveals something genuinely uncomfortable about the sport Enzo had dedicated his entire adult life to building. Motorsport during this particular era of automotive history carried real, substantial danger. Danger that claimed human lives with disturbing regularity. Danger that Enzo, as the person constructing these powerful, high-speed machines and assembling the drivers brave enough to pilot them, could never fully separate himself from, regardless of how many championships his team ultimately won along the way. It is worth acknowledging honestly that pursuing something you love deeply, at the absolute highest possible level, sometimes carries genuine costs and consequences that cannot simply be celebrated away by focusing exclusively on trophies and victories. Ferrari's story contains both breathtaking triumph and genuine tragedy, often occurring within the very same racing season, sometimes within the very same race itself. Chapter 10. The Weight of Losing a Son. Of every difficult chapter contained within Enzo Ferrari's long, eventful life, none struck deeper or left more permanent scars than the death of his beloved son Dino in 1956. Dino had been diagnosed with a form of muscular dystrophy, and in the months leading directly up to his death at only 24 years old, he had been working closely alongside his father, contributing meaningfully to the engineering development of a new V6 racing engine. Dino's death devastated Enzo in ways that observers close to him described as genuinely transformative. He began wearing black clothing every single day for the remainder of his life, a visible, permanent expression of mourning. He made regular private visits to his son's grave, and he gradually withdrew from much of public life, increasingly retreating into a quieter, more private existence behind the demanding, relentless work of running his racing empire. In tribute to his son's memory and his final engineering contributions, Enzo named the resulting engine, and eventually an entire line of Ferrari road cars, Dino, ensuring his son's name would remain permanently woven into the company's history and identity for generations of future owners and enthusiasts to encounter, whether or not they ever fully understood the deeply personal grief embedded within that particular name. Given the accumulated toll of losing his father, his brother, and now his own son, alongside the numerous driver deaths connected to his racing team, some observers at the time, including reportedly figures within the Vatican, began referring to Enzo using the harsh, unsettling phrase industrial Saturn, a reference to the mythological figure who consumed his own children. It is a brutal, uncomfortable label, yet it captures something genuinely true about the extraordinarily heavy personal cost that shadowed Enzo Ferrari's remarkable professional achievements throughout his entire life. There is something worth sitting with honestly in this particular chapter. Genuine, lasting success rarely arrives without cost, and sometimes that cost is measured in something far more painful than money or lost opportunities. Enzo continued building, continued competing, continued working, even while carrying grief heavy enough to permanently change the color of the clothes he wore for the rest of his life. Chapter 11. The Deal That Almost Changed Everything. By the early 1960s, despite Ferrari's continued racing success, the company's underlying finances remained genuinely fragile, a persistent problem given how much money competitive racing consistently demanded. In 1963, Enzo entered into secret, serious negotiations with the American automotive giant Ford Motor Company, discussing a potential deal that would have seen Ford essentially acquire and merge with Ferrari, injecting substantial financial resources into the struggling Italian company. The negotiations reportedly progressed quite far, involving a proposed deal valued at roughly $10 million, a genuinely enormous sum for the era. But at the very final stage of these negotiations, Enzo discovered a specific condition buried within Ford's proposed agreement, one that would have stripped him of direct personal control over Ferrari's racing budget and strategic racing decisions, placing that authority instead firmly in Ford's corporate hands. For Enzo, this single condition proved completely unacceptable, regardless of the substantial financial benefits the broader deal otherwise offered. Racing had never simply been a business line item to him. It represented the very core purpose behind everything he had built since 1947, the entire reason Ferrari existed as a company in the first place. He abruptly ended the negotiations, walking away from the deal entirely at what felt, to Ford's negotiating team, like the very last possible moment. Ford's leadership, reportedly furious at how the negotiations had collapsed, responded by launching an enormously well-funded effort specifically designed to defeat Ferrari directly on the racetrack, where competitive pride and reputation mattered most intensely to Enzo personally. Ferrari had already dominated the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans endurance race for 6 consecutive years, from 1960 through 1965. Ford's resulting racing program, built around a car called the GT40, subsequently defeated Ferrari at Le Mans 4 consecutive times, from 1966 through 1969, transforming what began as a failed corporate acquisition into one of the most celebrated rivalries in all of motorsport history. There is a striking truth worth remembering from this particular chapter. Enzo willingly sacrificed an enormous financial opportunity, specifically to protect his personal control over the one thing that genuinely mattered most to him. Not every valuable opportunity deserves to be accepted, particularly when accepting it would mean surrendering control over whatever originally made a person's life work meaningful to them in the first place. Chapter 12. Letting Go to Survive. By the late 1960s, Ferrari's persistent financial difficulties had grown increasingly serious, and Enzo, now facing his own declining health, needed a genuine, sustainable long-term solution for his company's future. In 1969, he ultimately agreed to sell 50% ownership of Ferrari to Fiat, the very same Italian manufacturing giant that had rejected his job application as a young man decades earlier, for a price of approximately $3.4 million. The specific terms of this agreement revealed exactly what Enzo valued most, even in this significant, difficult compromise. While Fiat gained substantial ownership and would eventually control 90% of the company following Enzo's death, Enzo negotiated carefully to retain direct personal control over Scuderia Ferrari, the racing division that remained throughout his entire life, the true heart and soul of everything he had built. Fiat's involvement primarily focused instead on managing and expanding Ferrari's road car business. The commercial side of the company Enzo had always privately viewed as secondary to racing itself. This particular arrangement also included an unusual personal provision. Enzo's illegitimate son, Piero Ferrari, born from a relationship outside his marriage, was formally guaranteed a 10% ownership stake in the company following Enzo's eventual death, ensuring some direct family connection would remain permanently woven into Ferrari's ownership structure for future generations, alongside Fiat's much larger industrial stake. There is a quiet, practical wisdom embedded within this final major business decision. Enzo did not stubbornly refuse every form of outside help or partnership throughout his life, despite his fierce, well-documented independence and his earlier refusal to accept Ford's more restrictive proposed terms. When circumstances genuinely required it, he was willing to accept meaningful compromise, carefully protecting only the one specific element, direct control over racing, that mattered most deeply to him personally, while allowing broader business operations to be managed by others better positioned to handle that particular responsibility. Chapter 13. The Legacy of the Prancing Horse. Enzo Ferrari continued working, directing, and personally overseeing his beloved racing team well into his advanced years, remaining actively involved in the company's operations almost until the very end of his long, eventful life. He passed away on August 14, 1988, in Maranello, Italy, the same small town where his company's headquarters and legendary factory still operate to this very day. He was 90 years old. Step back now and consider the complete shape of this remarkable, difficult journey. A boy who fell permanently in love with the sound of racing engines at the age of 10. A young man who lost his father, his brother, and very nearly his own life within the span of just a few devastating years. A rejected job applicant who quietly built his reputation instead through humble, unglamorous work most people today have never heard of. A driver who discovered his true genius was not behind the wheel, but in the demanding work of building winning teams around him. A man who lost the very racing organization he had spent a decade constructing, only to patiently wait out a legal restriction before building an entirely new company under his own name. A leader who structured his entire business specifically to protect one singular, unwavering passion, even when doing so meant enormous financial risk. A father whose deepest, most permanent grief came not from any racetrack tragedy, but from the loss of his own beloved son. A negotiator who walked away from an enormous fortune rather than surrender control over what genuinely mattered most to him. And finally, a pragmatic businessman who accepted meaningful compromise late in life, specifically to ensure his life's true purpose, competitive racing, would continue safely into the future, long after he himself was gone. None of this unfolded as a smooth, effortless rise toward glory. It unfolded instead as an extraordinarily difficult sequence of devastating losses, painful rejections, broken partnerships, and repeated tragedy, each one somehow absorbed, processed, and eventually transformed into fuel for whatever Enzo chose to build next. The prancing horse that today decorates some of the most desirable, expensive automobiles on the entire planet was never simply a clever marketing symbol. It was, in many genuine respects, a permanent monument to everything one determined man survived, endured, and refused to abandon across nearly 7 full decades of relentless, demanding work. So here is the real question worth carrying away from this story today, not only as English learners practicing your listening skills, but as people quietly building your own version of a life's purpose somewhere in your own journey. What is the single spark from your own early life, however small it may currently seem, that you have perhaps allowed circumstances, rejection, or grief to quietly push aside? What genuine control over your own true priorities might be worth protecting, even at real financial or personal cost, the way Enzo protected his control over racing rather than accepting Ford's far more lucrative but restrictive offer? And what difficult losses in your own life might eventually become, with enough time and enough stubborn persistence, the very fuel that carries you toward something meaningful you have not yet even fully imagined? Enzo Ferrari did not build one of the most legendary names in automotive history because his life was easy, fortunate, or free of genuine suffering. He built it because he refused to let devastating loss, repeated rejection, and painful compromise ever fully extinguish the single spark first lit in him as a 10-year-old boy, standing beside a racetrack in Bologna, watching machines move faster than anything he had ever witnessed before. That brings us to the end of today's story. If you understood most of what you just listened to, that is real, measurable progress in your English listening skills. If certain parts felt difficult or moved quickly, that is completely normal, and nothing to feel discouraged about at all. Listen again whenever you need to. Repetition, as we always say here on English Lane, is exactly where genuine fluency quietly grows over time. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with us today. If this story of grief, obsession, and unbreakable purpose moved you or helped your English even a little bit today, please subscribe to English Lane so you never miss the next true story we bring you next. Keep listening, keep learning, and keep protecting whatever small spark first drew you toward your own version of a meaningful life. We will see you in the next video.